The thing about galactic civilization, the real kicker that nobody puts in the tourism brochures or the diplomatic briefings, is that it operates on a carefully maintained illusion of sophistication. 17,000 species spanning 42 galaxies, all convinced they've evolved past their baser instincts, all pretending that conquest and violence are relics of their primitive pasts. They've got committees for everything, councils that oversee other councils, and enough bureaucratic red tape to gift-wrap a small moon. And yet, somehow, the bounty hunting industry remains not just legal, but thriving. Funny how that works. The Crindax Consortium had been tracking Deathworld specimens for 3 generations, which in their chronology meant roughly 70 standard years of accumulated expertise, technological refinement, and what they generously called successful acquisitions. Their business model was elegant in its simplicity. Identify rare organisms from high-gravity, high-danger worlds, capture them alive when possible, and sell them to the highest bidder. Sometimes to private collectors, sometimes to research facilities, sometimes to people whose intentions were best left unexamined in polite company. The consortium didn't ask questions, which made them very popular in certain circles and absolutely reviled in others. Now, Earth had been on the restricted Deathworld list for exactly 43 years, ever since a human delegation had attended the first contact summit, and a minor diplomatic incident had occurred involving what humans called a firm handshake, and what the Velaran ambassador called attempted murder by crushing force. The classification committee, in their infinite wisdom, had slapped a level 7 hazard designation on humanity's homeworld, which put it in the same category as planets where the atmosphere was made of sulfuric acid and the native wildlife hunted in organized military formations. Insurance companies refused to underwrite any expedition to Earth. Tourism agencies deleted it from their databases. Even the military recruiters, who normally loved Deathworlders for their durability and aggression, approached human candidates with unusual caution. But restrictions, as any economist will tell you, only drive up market value. A live human specimen could fetch 40 million credits on the black market. Tissue samples went for $500,000. Even hair follicles had value to genetic research labs working on classified military projects. The Crindax Consortium had been watching this market with considerable interest, running calculations, assessing risk-to-reward ratios, and generally doing what amoral profit-seekers do when they spot an opportunity wrapped in danger and tied with a bow made of terrible ideas. Their mistake, the really spectacular error in judgment that would later be studied in business schools across the galaxy as an example of catastrophic risk assessment failure, was assuming that a human away from Earth would be somehow diminished, separated from her natural habitat, less dangerous, more vulnerable. It was the kind of logic that seemed sound in a climate-controlled office, but fell apart the moment it encountered reality. The Celestial Navigation Academy on Station Helios 7 was considered one of the premier educational institutions in the sector. The kind of place where the children of diplomats, corporate executives, and minor nobility went to learn how to pilot ships through subspace without accidentally creating temporal paradoxes. The station itself was a masterwork of engineering. A rotating habitat wheel large enough to house 50,000 permanent residents, with carefully maintained gravity sections that gradually decreased as you moved toward the central hub. The Academy occupied 3 full decks in the mid-gravity zone, which accommodated the widest range of species comfortably. Comfortably, of course, being a relative term. The human exchange student, currently sitting in advanced stellar cartography and absolutely destroying the curve for everyone else, had been at the Academy for 6 months. She'd arrived through a cultural exchange program that someone in the Earth Diplomatic Corps had pushed through over numerous objections. protests, and at least one anonymous threat. Her presence had required extensive facility modifications, including reinforced furniture, recalibrated gravity plating in her quarters to simulate Earth-standard conditions, and a liability waiver so comprehensive it had its own table of contents. Her classmates, a collection of species from across the civilized galaxy, had spent the first month treating her like an unexploded ordnance that had wandered into their classroom. The Velaran students, with their crystalline exoskeletons and decidedly fragile constitution, had requested seat reassignments to put maximum distance between themselves and the human. The Threxian delegation had filed a formal complaint about atmospheric violence after she'd sneezed once. Even Professor Kelmath, who'd taught at the academy for 30 years and prided himself on his unflappable demeanor, had needed 2 weeks to stop flinching every time she raised her hand to ask a question. But time, that great normalizer, had done its work. 6 months in, she was just another student. Slightly odd, unnervingly strong, with a tendency to find humor in situations that terrified everyone else, but nonetheless just part of the classroom ecosystem. She sat in the back row, not because she was trying to hide, but because she'd learned that her classmates concentrated better when they weren't watching her breathe, and wondering if each exhale was some kind of predatory behavior. She took notes on a datapad like everyone else. She turned in assignments on time. She even participated in study groups, though these sessions required careful orchestration to prevent panic attacks. The particular afternoon when everything went sideways had been unremarkably ordinary. Professor Kelmath had spent 2 hours explaining the gravitational cascade effects of twin star systems using holographic projections that filled the center of the classroom with swirling stellar matter. The human had asked 3 questions, all of them intelligent enough to make the professor reconsider some of his own assumptions. A Zypharian student had nearly fallen asleep, their electromagnetic field pulsing with the slow rhythm of encroaching unconsciousness. Someone's datapad had chimed with an incoming message, earning a disapproving look from the professor. Standard academic theater, the kind of mundane ritual that played out in classrooms across the galaxy every single day. When class ended, the usual exodus began. The Velaran students hurried out first, as they always did, moving in their characteristic quick-step shuffle. The Threxians followed, floating more than walking, their gas-filled bodies drifting toward the corridor. The human, as was her habit, stayed behind to ask follow-up questions, this time about gravitational shear effects on subspace field stability. Professor Kelmath, who'd grown to appreciate her genuine curiosity, was mid-explanation when his datapad chirped with an emergency alert. The hunters had chosen their timing with professional precision. They'd bypassed station security by hacking credentials from a maintenance crew, entered through a cargo airlock in the lower decks, and moved through the station's service corridors with practiced efficiency. 4 members in the strike team, each a Krindax warrior in their prime, equipped with enough firepower to siege a small fortress and the kind of overconfidence that comes from 36 successful hunts. They'd studied the human schedule, tracked her movements, identified the optimal capture window. Alone, separated from the herd, in a confined space with limited exits. The tactical situation couldn't be better. They breached the classroom door with shaped charges that should have stunned everyone inside. Should have, being the operative term. Professor Kelmath dropped immediately, his nervous system overwhelmed by the sonic pulse. The human, standing 5 feet away from the blast point, stumbled slightly, shook her head like she'd heard an annoying sound, and turned to face the doorway with an expression that could best be described as irritated confusion. The lead hunter, a scarred veteran named Krex, who'd captured everything from Thandorian acid spitters to Gormanthi pack alphas, advanced into the room with his restraint cannon raised. He'd expected unconsciousness or at minimum disorientation. What he got instead was a human girl looking at him like he'd interrupted something important, which technically he had, but not in the way that should have mattered. His 3 team members fanned out behind him, covering angles, setting up overlapping fields of fire, executing the practiced choreography of experienced predators. Human, designation confirmed, Krex announced, more for the recording than for his team. The consortium liked documentation, made the sales easier. Beginning pacification protocol. The human looked at Professor Kelmath's unconscious form, then back at the hunters, then down at her datapad where her unfinished notes glowed softly. When she spoke, her voice carried the kind of dangerous calm that should have been a warning sign. "You interrupted my office hours." Krex fired the restraint cannon, a weapon designed to envelope targets in a molecular binding foam that hardened on contact. At this range, against most species, it was completely reliable. The foam shot across the classroom, expanding as it traveled, ready to encase the human completely. She moved, not with the desperate panic of prey, but with the efficient economy of someone deeply annoyed, grabbing a desk and swinging it in an arc that caught the foam mid-flight. The desk, now thoroughly encased, crashed into the far wall with enough force to crack the reinforced polymer paneling. That was Academy property, she observed, her tone suggesting this was the real crime being committed. The second hunter, faster than his leader, activated a neural disruptor, a nasty piece of technology that scrambled synaptic signals and dropped most life forms into instant unconsciousness. The beam hit the human square in the chest. She blinked, looked down at herself, looked back up at the hunter. "Did you just tase me?" What followed would later be described in the official incident report filed by station security as a spontaneous decompensation of tactical cohesion, followed by rapid asset degradation, which was bureaucratic language for a catastrophic beating delivered with improvised weapons and what appeared to be genuine annoyance rather than fear or rage. The human grabbed her chair, a standard-issue Academy seat designed to support up to 200 kilograms in station-standard gravity. In her hands, it became a club with a 4-foot reach. She closed the distance to the second hunter before he could recalibrate his disruptor, swinging the chair in an overhead arc that would have looked ridiculous if it hadn't connected with enough force to shatter his helmet and send him sprawling across 3 rows of desks. The Krindak's armor, rated to withstand small arms fire and kinetic impacts up to 3,000 joules, crumpled like decorative foil. Krex, to his credit, adapted quickly. He dropped the restraint cannon and drew his combat blade, 5 feet of molecularly aligned alloy, sharp enough to slice through starship hull plating. He'd trained for close combat, spent decades mastering blade work, fought opponents in zero gravity, high gravity, underwater, in complete darkness. He moved in with textbook form, leading with a thrust aimed at center mass, ready to redirect based on her response. She caught his wrist, just reached out and grabbed it, stopping the blade 6 inches from her torso. The expression on her face suggested she was working through a particularly annoying math problem. Krex pulled, pushed, tried to twist free, but her grip was absolute. Human hands, it turned out, were evolution's answer to the question, "One. How do you hold on to things in a gravity well that wants to kill you constantly?" The answer involved bone density, tendon strength, and grip force that made industrial machinery look inadequate. "You know what the worst part about this is?" she asked conversationally, still holding his wrist. "I'm going to miss the study group tonight. We were going to cover subspace harmonics." She twisted and Krex's wrist snapped with a sound like breaking pottery. He screamed, which was unprofessional, but entirely understandable. She took the blade from his suddenly nerveless fingers and looked at it critically. "This is actually pretty nice. Is this military grade?" The third and fourth hunters opened fire simultaneously, energy weapons that carved glowing lines through the air. Station regulations strictly prohibited military-grade weapons, but the Crindax Consortium had never been overly concerned with regulations. The beams should have vaporized her. Instead, she moved, dropping below the first volley and using Krex's now limp form as a shield against the second. The energy blasts hit his armor and scattered, losing cohesion, filling the classroom with the smell of ozone and scorched metal. "You're shooting your own guy," she called out, her tone suggesting this was a tactical error worth noting. "Is this your first time? This feels like it's your first time." She threw Krex at the third hunter, a casual underhanded toss that sent 80 kilograms of Crindax warrior sailing through the classroom's reduced gravity like a very unhappy projectile. They collided with a meaty thump, went down in a tangle of limbs and equipment. The fourth hunter, demonstrating the survival instincts that had kept him alive through 20 successful hunts, turned and ran for the door. He made it 3 steps before a datapad hit him in the back of the head. Not her datapad. She'd grabbed someone's abandoned unit from a nearby desk. It struck with enough force to crack his helmet and send him face first into the doorframe. He crumpled, unconscious before he hit the floor. "Sorry about the datapad," she shouted to the empty classroom, then paused. Wait, whose was that? The third hunter, having extracted himself from beneath his leader, made one last desperate play. He activated a stasis grenade, the kind of weapon that created a localized temporal distortion field, freezing everything within a 5-meter radius for approximately 30 seconds. It was a last resort weapon, expensive and single-use, but perfect for this situation. He triggered it and threw, the grenade sailing through the air in a perfect arc. She caught it one-handed, looked at it, and threw it back faster than he could process. The grenade detonated between them, the stasis field expanding, catching him completely while she'd already stepped outside its radius. He froze mid-motion, locked in temporal suspension, his expression captured in that terrible moment of realization when you know you've made a catastrophic mistake. The human walked over to Krex, who was attempting to crawl toward his dropped weapon with his one functional arm. She stepped on the restraint cannon, not hard enough to break it, just enough to pin it in place. So, here's what I don't understand. You guys are professionals, right? You do this for a living. Why would you target someone in a space station? I mean, there's nowhere to go. It's a closed environment. Did you think this through? Krex said something in Crindax that didn't translate well, but carried the universal tone of someone who'd realized too late that they'd made several bad decisions. Right. Okay, you're in pain. That's fair, she acknowledged. She grabbed him by his armor's carry handle and dragged him toward the door where the fourth hunter lay unconscious. Let me tell you about my day. I woke up at 600 because my roommate, who's Velaran, by the way, needs absolute silence and total darkness to sleep, and the walls are thin. I had breakfast, which is this protein paste stuff, because the station doesn't stock Earth food. It's supposed to be nutritionally complete, but tastes like sadness mixed with regret. Then I had quantum field theory, which I'm barely passing because the math is in base 14 and my brain still thinks in base 10. Then stellar cartography, which is actually interesting, and I was finally understanding gravitational shear effects when you guys showed up. She dropped Krex next to his unconscious colleague. The second hunter was groaning, semi-conscious. his shattered helmet leaking atmosphere seals. The third hunter remained frozen in stasis, a statue of regret. So now I've got to deal with station security, file an incident report, probably talk to the diplomats, and I still have a 15-page paper due on subspace navigation hazards near neutron stars. Do you see the problem here? Station security arrived roughly 8 minutes after the breach, which was actually quite prompt by galactic standards, but felt like geological time to everyone involved. They entered the classroom with weapons drawn, ready to confront dangerous intruders, and instead found a human girl sitting on a desk, swinging her legs casually, surrounded by 4 incapacitated hunters in varying states of consciousness and injury. "Oh, good. You're here?" she said, her relief genuine. "Can you guys move them? I need to check on Professor Kelmath." The security chief, a Dracovian named Sergeant Thule, who'd served in 2 military campaigns and thought he'd seen everything, stared at the scene with his jaw hanging open. What happened here? "They tried to kidnap me," she explained, hopping off the desk. "Used some kind of stun device on the professor. He's old, so maybe check him first. And that guy," she pointed at the stasis-frozen hunter, "has about 10 more seconds in temporal lock. You should probably restrain him before he unfreezes." The medical team arrived next, followed by the Academy's dean, then a delegation from the diplomatic corps, and finally a very nervous insurance adjuster who kept muttering about liability coverage while examining the damage. The classroom looked like a small war had occurred, which wasn't far from the truth. Desks overturned, walls cracked, scorch marks from energy weapons, and one section of floor that had been punched hard enough to dent the deck plating beneath. Professor Kelmath regained consciousness to find himself in the Academy's medical center, the human sitting in the chair next to his bed, reviewing her notes. What happened?" "Someone tried to kidnap me during office hours," she said apologetically. "Sorry about that. Should we reschedule our discussion about gravitational shear?" The interrogation lasted 6 hours. The station security, the diplomatic corps, the Academy administration, even representatives from the Crindax Consortium's legal team all wanted statements, explanations, documentation. The human answered every question patiently, describing the incident in careful detail, occasionally asking if anyone had water, because talking this much was making her thirsty. The surviving hunters, once they were conscious and in custody, provided their own testimony, which largely consisted of shocked disbelief and repeated assertions that nothing in their intelligence briefing had suggested this outcome was possible. The stasis-frozen hunter, upon being thawed and revived, immediately requested political asylum and refused to speak about the incident, except to say that he was retiring from bounty hunting effective immediately. The Academy's communication channels exploded with the news. Students who'd attended classes with the human for months suddenly remembered every tiny interaction with new context. "She helped me with my math homework," became a story about being tutored by an apex predator. "She borrowed my notes," transformed into a tale of surviving an encounter with a Deathworlder. The Velaran students, who'd spent 6 months nervous in her presence, felt simultaneously vindicated and terrified. Galactic news networks picked up the story within hours. "Human student defeats professional hunting team" was the polite headline. "Deathworlder dismantles Crindax warriors with furniture" was more popular. The feeds lit up with commentary, analysis, and a tremendous amount of "I told you so" from Earth's diplomatic corps. The consortium stock price dropped 14% in the first hour of trading. But the real repercussions, the ones that would echo through galactic society for years, were already beginning to propagate through various bureaucracies. The Deathworld Classification Committee convened an emergency session to review humanity's threat assessment. Earth's Level 7 designation was upgraded to Level 9, a category previously occupied only by planets where the ecosystem actively hunted spaceships. Insurance companies that underwrote bounty hunting contracts immediately added exclusions for any operations involving human targets. 3 other hunting consortiums announced they were discontinuing Deathworlder acquisitions entirely, citing unacceptable risk factors. The Celestial Navigation Academy faced its own reckoning. The board of directors called an emergency meeting to discuss security protocols, liability concerns, and whether hosting Deathworld students was compatible with their educational mission. The debate lasted 14 hours and ended with a split decision to continue the exchange program, but with significantly enhanced security measures, all of which the human pointed out would do absolutely nothing to prevent a similar incident. "Look," she explained to the extremely nervous dean, "if someone wants to start trouble, security measures won't stop them. You know what actually keeps people safe? Consequences. And now everyone knows what the consequences are." The dean, a Threxian administrator who'd held his position for 20 years without incident until 6 months ago, made a note that looked suspiciously like a resignation letter. "Miss, with all due respect, you hospitalized 4 professional hunters." "They attacked me during class," she countered. "What was I supposed to do? Die politely?" The diplomatic fallout took weeks to resolve. Earth's embassy filed formal complaints about the assassination attempt. The Crindax Consortium's home government issued carefully worded apologies, while simultaneously distancing themselves from the operation. Various species representatives called for stricter controls on Deathworld interactions, while others argued this incident proved that humanity should be given wider access to galactic society, since they were clearly capable of defending themselves. The debates were heated, lengthy, and ultimately inconclusive, which meant everything stayed mostly the same, except everyone was now more nervous. The human, for her part, returned to class the next day, sat in the same seat in the back row, took notes on the lecture about quantum navigation through dark matter regions, raised her hand to ask a clarifying question about particle interference patterns. Her classmates, who'd spent the previous evening watching news coverage of her dismantling a professional hunting team, stared at her like she'd grown a second head. During break, a Veloran student named Trix approached her desk with visible trepidation. "I wanted to ask, weren't you scared?" The human looked up from her notes. "Of what?" "Of them. The hunters. They had weapons, experience, they were professionals." She considered this. I was annoyed. They interrupted office hours, I have a paper due, and now I need to attend all these administrative meetings. But scared? She shook her head. "They were trying to kidnap me. If I let fear stop me from defending myself, I'd be someone else's property right now. That seems worse than a fight." Trix processed this, their crystalline features reflecting the classroom lights. "On my world, if predators come, we hide. We don't fight." "Different evolutionary paths," the human said diplomatically. "Your world probably doesn't have bears." "What's a bear?" "Something that will absolutely eat you and doesn't care about your feelings on the matter. When you grow up on a planet with bears and wolves and tigers and poison ivy and mosquitoes and a dozen other things trying to kill you, you develop a certain attitude about conflict." The classroom slowly filled as break ended. Professor Kelmath entered, looking tired but recovered, with a medical scanner attached to his temple to monitor his brain function. He caught the human's eye and nodded once, a gesture of gratitude that needed no translation. Then he began the lecture on gravitational lens effects near black holes, and the universe continued its slow rotation toward entropy, as it always had, as it always would. In the lower decks, in a holding cell awaiting trial, Krex sat with his arm in a regeneration cast, reviewing the mission recordings on a datapad. He'd watched the footage 17 times, analyzing every decision, every tactical choice, looking for the moment where it all went wrong. The problem, he was beginning to realize, wasn't tactical. They'd had superior numbers, better equipment, the element of surprise. The problem was fundamental. They'd assumed that something separated from its natural environment would be diminished, weakened, easier to handle. They'd forgotten that humans didn't come from a gentle world that produced gentle people. They came from a planet that actively tried to kill its inhabitants, and the ones who survived and thrived were the ones who learned to hit back harder. His legal team had advised cooperation, full disclosure, detailed testimony, throwing himself on the mercy of the court. The consortium had already cut ties, declaring the operation unauthorized and unsanctioned, leaving him and his team to face charges alone. The irony wasn't lost on him. They'd hunted across the galaxy, captured specimens from 100 worlds, built reputations as apex predators in the galactic food chain. And they'd been taken down by one annoyed student armed with classroom furniture and a complete absence of fear. The human's paper on subspace navigation hazards was turned in on time, 48 hours later. She received a 92% score, losing points for what Professor Kelmath called insufficient attention to theoretical edge cases, which she accepted with good grace. Her study group met as scheduled, though attendance was notably higher than usual, with several students who'd never shown interest in subspace harmonics suddenly finding reasons to attend. She answered their questions, shared her notes, and helped a Zephyrian student work through a particularly difficult quantum probability calculation. Life at the academy continued, changed in small ways that accumulated into something larger. Students were more careful about assumptions. Security was more vigilant. The diplomatic corps added 17 new clauses to the exchange program agreements. And somewhere in the galactic bureaucracy, a tired administrator updated humanity's file to include a new notation, significantly more dangerous when annoyed. Recommend against interrupting academic activities. 3 weeks after the incident, the human received a message from Earth. Her younger brother, currently in his final year of secondary education, had seen the news coverage and wanted to know if the stories were exaggerated. She sent back a short video, showing her sitting in the repaired classroom, surrounded by alien classmates, looking entirely ordinary, except for the way everyone maintained a slightly wider personal space bubble around her than before. "Hey, not exaggerated," she said to the camera. "But also, context matters. They started it. I was just defending myself. Tell Mom I'm fine and my grades are good. Also tell her the food here is terrible and I miss real pizza. Love you. See you during break." She sent the message and returned to studying, because the midterm exam on relativistic effects in faster-than-light travel was in 2 days, and passing required actual effort even for someone who could casually dismantle professional hunters. The universe, she'd learned, didn't grade on a curve for Deathworlders. You either knew the material or you didn't, and no amount of gravitational advantage or bone density helped you calculate temporal drift in subspace corridors. That, in the end, was perhaps the most unsettling thing about humans for the rest of galactic civilization. Not that they were dangerous, though they absolutely were. Not that they came from a world that forged them into walking weapons, though that was certainly true. What really disturbed the collective consciousness of 17,000 species was that humans knew they were dangerous, acknowledged it, and then just went about their lives. Studying, working, forming friendships, pursuing goals, as if the capacity for violence was just another trait like hair color or height preference. They didn't apologize for it, didn't seem burdened by it, treated it as simply another tool in their evolutionary toolkit. The Crindax Consortium dissolved 18 months later, their business model rendered obsolete by a single viral incident. Other hunting organizations revised their target lists, removing humans and, interestingly, several other species that had previously seemed docile. The galactic community's understanding of Deathworld expanded, becoming less about planetary classification and more about recognizing that survivors of harsh environments carried their survival instincts with them wherever they went. And the human, whose name was never recorded in the official reports due to privacy protocols, but whose actions echoed through galactic culture for decades, graduated with honors. She received job offers from 17 different organizations, including 3 that wanted to hire her specifically for security consulting. She declined most of them, accepting a position with a research expedition studying anomalous gravitational phenomena near the galactic core. Quiet work, scientific, exactly what she wanted. On her last day at the academy, she stopped by Professor Kelmath's office to thank him for his instruction. He looked at her, this student who'd changed everything just by being herself, and asked the question that had bothered him for months. Were you ever actually worried during the attack? She thought about it honestly. I was worried I'd hurt them too badly. That sounds weird, I know, but they weren't trying to kill me, just capture me. So I had to calibrate force appropriately. That's actually harder than just defending yourself. You have to worry about proportional response, legal consequences, whether you're going to get expelled for hospitalizing someone. Self-defense is easy. Regulated self-defense is complicated. Professor Kelmath, who'd survived 3 decades in academia and thought he understood complicated, realized he'd only been scratching the surface. I hope, he said carefully, that wherever you go, people have the good sense not to interrupt your work. She smiled, the expression warm and genuine and completely at odds with the warrior who'd torn through 4 professional hunters with improvised weapons. That's all I've ever wanted, she said, just to be left alone to do my job. She left the academy that afternoon, her belongings packed in 2 modest cases, heading toward a future among the stars. Behind her, she left a changed institution, revised threat assessments, and a very important lesson that would be taught in military academies, diplomatic schools, and hunting lodges across the galaxy for generations to come. Never assume that prey is helpless just because it's separated from its natural habitat. Sometimes the habitat is portable. Sometimes it's carried in the bones, muscles, and neural pathways of a species forged by a world that never stopped trying to kill it. And sometimes, when you're hunting the apex predator, you don't realize until far too late that you were never the hunter at all. Claude can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.